Okay, we're getting started with part two, but first, another joke. What's a scientist's favorite flavor of gum? Experiment. All right, guys, we're going to move on and we're going to talk about the first step of photosynthesis, right? Which is the light reactions. Those happen in photosystem 2, right? And photosystem 1, okay? Now, as I mentioned when we were looking at the parts of the thylakoid, photosystem 2 is first. It's actually the first step, okay? Where do we find photosystem 2? Based on your diagram, where was it? What's that little structure called that we did all those labels for?
The thylakoid membrane.
The thylakoid membrane. So that is our location where it happens, okay? The thylakoid membrane.
Did you
Okay.
get to unpause it?
Oh, it's good.
Okay.
Thanks for checking, though. Okay. All right, so the primary function of photosystem 2 is to make one of the ingredients that goes into the dark reactions. All right, if we remember, the ingredients in the dark reactions are carbon dioxide, ATP, and NADPH. The carbon dioxide comes from the air, so it doesn't have to be made. So the two that have to be made are ATP and NADPH. The primary function of photosystem 2 is to make the ATP. Let me put make here. Make ATP. Okay? Basically, it gets ADP and turns ADP into ATP. So it doesn't have to make it from scratch. It gets it from the dark reactions, turns it back into ATP. Okay? We got that written down? Make ATP. That is the main function of photosystem 2. All right, and it does this in 5 simple steps. We're going to break it on down so that we know exactly what happens. All right, I'm going to go to my zipper here and take a quick sip. And here we go. So, here is the first step, okay? First step is H2O is split by that water splitting enzyme, okay, into H and O, right? So the water is split up into some hydrogen ions and some oxygen, okay? Step 2, okay, is that photons hit the chlorophyll. And this solar energy gets an electron excited. Remember we talked about excited electrons yesterday? So the solar energy now gets transferred to an electron, and that electron is filled with energy. So we call it excited. Okay? So a single electron, that's why there's so many thylakoids in the chloroplast, and why there are so many chloroplasts in the plant cells, and why there are so many cells in the leaves, right? Each one of those only excites a single electron, but when you put them all together, you have a tremendous amount of energy that can be used to create these molecules, okay? Once the electron is excited, okay, it moves along that electron transport chain. It moves on the ETC to the hydrogen ion pump. So it's almost like the electron is like electricity, right? And it's like we're going to plug the pump in. So the electrons move from the plug down the cord to the pump, right? That's how electricity works, and that's exactly what's happening here in the thylakoid. This electron transport chain is like a cord, and it's plugged in one end. It's plugged into the photopigment complex, right? And the sunlight hits it, and now electricity in the form of electrons, energy in the form of electrons, is moving along this ETC to this ion pump. And what it does is it powers the pump, right? Okay, it actually powers the pump. Okay, so the pump fills the thylakoid with hydrogen ions. So when we learned about diffusion, right, we learned that in its natural state, there's going to be the same amount of hydrogen on the outside of the thylakoid as there is on the inside of the thylakoid, right? Because nature likes things to be in balance. Well, so in order to move against the concentration gradient and stuff all the hydrogen into the thylakoid, so to speak, like we talked about stuffing things into a closet, it takes energy, because that's an active form of transport. So to actively transport the hydrogen into the thylakoid and basically fill the thylakoid with hydrogen ions, you got to have this energy from this electron. Now eventually, the electron gives away all its energy and becomes no longer excited because it's had to work so hard to power this pump. Okay? All right? So what happens is that the electron loses energy, okay? And so it moves to, and I'm just going to write photo 1. Okay? So it's lost its energy, and now it's got to go moving on. It can't power the pump anymore. All right? So does everybody understand what's happening then, basically? Okay? You understand, Zane, what's happening basically? Is this process, right? So the water gets split. The reason the water gets split is because that creates hydrogen ions, right? Then the photons, the chlorophyll turns that sunlight into excited electrons, which then work in the same way like electricity would work to power this organic pump that fills the thylakoid with hydrogen ions. Once that's done, the electron has given up its energy and moves on down the line. Now this is happening constantly, right? Because the sunlight is constantly hitting the chloroplasts and the thylakoids, right?
Yes, sir.
So electrons are constantly moving on down. It's not just one, it's one electron at a time, but there's lots of electrons moving along this chain. Okay? Moving along the chain. So, how does this produce ATP? Well, that's what happens in the next part of this process. All right? The ATP production. We'll talk about that now. Yeah, you know me. You down with ATP? Yeah, you know me. We're all down with ATP because we'd be dead without it. Okay. Alrighty. So which protein complex in the ETC after photosystem 2 produces ATP? Look at your diagram and tell me which of those things we labeled makes ATP. An extra chip for the first person to figure it out. Come on.
The ATP Smith phase.
Smith phase, yeah. ATP synthase, but yes, good job, Zane. You earned a chip. You were close there, Venzel. Speedy on the draw. Okay, so yes, the ATP, right? It's pretty obvious because that's its name, ATP synthase. Okay? That makes the ATP. Okay? All right, so what this is, okay, is to describe it, okay, it's a channel or tunnel. When I say channel, I mean tunnel for H plus ions. All right. So how does this work? All right, what did the hydrogen ion pump just do? That we just talked about.
Squirt out water.
No, it's hydrogen ion pump. What did it just do?
Pump out.
It pumped ions into the thylakoid.
Yeah.
Okay, just like you inflate a balloon. So imagine a balloon filled with hydrogen, right? Now you open up the ATP synthase. That's the same as untying the balloon and opening up the end. What's going to happen to all the hydrogen inside the balloon?
Come out.
It's going to rush out. That energy of motion, that rushing, is a form of energy. Movement is a form of energy. So,
Active.
yes, so it helps, it creates, because the hydrogen wants to balance out again, it's going to rush out of the thylakoid. Okay? So the ATP, ATP synthase, can't write today, opens, releasing the ions.
Wow.
This movement creates the energy to make ATP. Because remember, bonds require energy. So if you're going to bond a phosphate to ADP to make it ATP, we're making a TP, guys. No. No. If you're going to create a bond, you need energy, because energy is in the bonds of atoms and molecules. Excuse me, in the bonds of molecules. So what happens to this ATP? We already know it is the ingredient in the Calvin cycle. So it goes on to the dark reactions that occur in the stroma. Okay, so if you guys got that written down before I move back to my diagram? Yeah? Because I'm going to use my diagram for a little demonstration. Ready? Okay. I'm not going to erase that, but, well, it might automatically erase if I don't say that. All right, so I'm going to take this, right, and I'm just going to snip the thylakoid. I don't need all my labels. All right. Okay. So, just a visual of what's happening really quickly. Okay. H2O gets split here, right? So H2O goes in and is split by this enzyme into H pluses and some O. Okay. That's an H2O. In addition, light particles hit this photosystem, this pigment complex, and excite an electron. All right, I'm going to use red for the electrons so we can see it on the ETC. All right, so we have an E right here, and it becomes excited, full of energy. Super E. Okay, so it moves along over here. All right, and it says, hey, pump, I know you need some energy. So I'm going to give you some energy, little pump. And that little pump is going to bring in, okay, if there were hydrogens out here, which there are, right, existing in just as ions, all right, it's going to fill this whole space. All right, it's pumping them up. Boom, 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 boom. It's full, 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 right? It's just cramming them in there, as many as it can cram in with the energy that it gets from those electrons until it's so full that it's just almost full, just crazy full. Now our electron, poor guy, he's been working his tail off. He's not so excited anymore. All right? He's just ordinary. Okay? But look, he's going to travel over here, okay, to this lovely photosystem right here. Well, guess what happens here? Sure enough, just like it did in the other one, I'm actually going to use like some gold here because this is sunlight. sunlight hits this one, right? And boom, what happens to our good old friend E?
Turns back to Super E again.
Oh, E is Super E. Da, 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 da. All right, he'll be Super E again in a minute. And we're going to talk about what Super E does next. FML, right? FML. Okay, so the last thing that happens here is what we were talking about. Here's this ATP synthase, right? So notice that right now it's closed off. So all it does is, because you got all this hydrogen up in here, this hydrogen's like, yo, thylakoid, let us out. Okay, so sure enough, it opens up and whoosh. All right, hydrogens start rushing out, okay, here, and that creates energy to make ATP, which is now out here in the stroma, okay? So does that give you a good visual of what happens? All right, super. Now we want to figure out, all right, the story of Super E, part 2. What happens to Super E after he gets done with the hydrogen ion pump? Next time on Super E. Super E goes shopping. Nope, here's what happens, okay? We go to photosystem 1, okay? Super E part 2. E does whatever a Super E does.
Look out for
Super E. He's an electron, you see. He's our favorite Super E.
Oh, you singing for a little bit.
Well, this is a song, right? Okay. So it goes on, the electron goes on to photosystem 1. All right. So basically, photosystem 1 is the pigment, right? The green stuff. And 2 proteins. All right. 2 proteins. It is also still, where is it located? In the thylakoid, right? All right, they're in the thylakoid membrane. Now, we have our ATP. We have our CO2. What's left to make? Anybody remember?
NADPH.
That's right, the bus, right? The bus that carries the hydrogen ion, so its goal is to make NADPH. This H here, that's that hydrogen ion that's going to provide energy for something else later on in the dark reactions. Okay? All right. So, all right. This should say what happens to the NADPH produced. It goes to the Calvin cycle. In my defense, I didn't actually make these note sheets. They come from Apex. So goes to the Calvin cycle. Okay, it's the other ingredient. So now we have all 3, right? We have ATP, NADPH, and CO2. So what happens in photosystem 1? Well, we already described it, right? Our tired E gets excited again.
I'm so tired.
Now, I'm Super again.
Right? Super E becomes a Super E. Okay?
Super
E.
Super
E. All right. Okay? All right. So eventually, all right, the tired E gets charged, okay, and it gets, okay, transported via NADPH to the stroma. Okay? All right? Okay? And it happens via the electron transport train. So ETC, okay, it's basically the road, okay, electrons travel. Okay, so it's not an actual road, obviously, but it's kind of like the road, or I think of chain and train, because it's almost like an electron transport train, you know what I mean, moving along the tracks. All right, and so all of these energy carrying molecules, right, okay, are used in the Calvin cycle, to make glucose. All right? Awesome. You guys are doing great. Okay, so that is what's happening there. All right? You guys getting that written down? Okay, so let's do a brief visual of this one, just so we understand the whole concept. Again, I'm just going to do a quick snip of my thylakoid, and we're just going to look at the last part, okay? So, we already know that good old E was tired, right? He was tired right here. He comes in, the light hits him, hits the photosystem pigment, boom, the chlorophyll is able to convert the solar energy into electrical energy, and we have, once again, Super E. All right, and then through its process, Super E moves along this ETC right here, all right, and that energy is used, it's bonded to NADP plus and NADPH, comes off of the end and into the stroma. Okay, so pretty straightforward. Most of the action happens here in photosystem 1. The second part, photosystem 2, is pretty simple. It just gets that electron re-excited and then is able to transport it over into the Calvin cycle. Okay? All right. So we're doing a great job here. I'm going to pause this video so I can break these apart when I upload them.